I want to introduce our Professor Extraordinaire, Dr. Maya Soetoro, who will be moderating today's event. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, mahalo. Thank you so much, Jose and Guy, for being here. And thank you for those of you in attendance and those of you watching on the live stream or after this recording is shared. We are going to have a wonderful conversation today about how a community building initiative in one of the country's most segregated cities is empowering people to actively build diverse and vibrant community spaces and ultimately the world that they want to live in. Our speaker today is Guy Ben-Aharon. He's a cultural entrepreneur, a stage director, a social innovator. Since 2010, Guy has staged and produced over 50 plays in translation through Israeli Stage, which he founded in 2010, the Goethe-Institut, Austrian Cultural Forum, Alliance Française, and swissnex. These productions were presented in partnership with over 50 academic and community centers in the US, Canada, Israel, and United Kingdom. This is just scratching the surface of his work because he has received a lot of recognition and he has contributed to so many endeavors. And we are so grateful that his journey has led him here to this conversation with us. So let's dive in. Welcome, Guy.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So tell us first, how was the idea for the jar born?
Sure.
Jar.
Yeah, so the jar is an organization based in Boston, and it's building a cultural community at the intersection of art, equity, and relationships. And what that really means is it's using the arts as a way to bring people together who wouldn't normally be together. And actively it invites people to actively live their values and make the uncomfortable comfortable. So talking to the person who they might not normally know, which is, as you said in your introduction, very important, especially in the city like Boston that is so segregated. And it was really born out of the fact that myself and a bunch of other people, a few co-founders, we were all finding ourselves in spaces where there was one group that was very dominant. So in many of Boston's traditional art spaces, a lot of older, wealthy white people dominated that space. But we were also finding ourselves in spaces that were mostly, mostly serving African-American audiences or Asian audiences. And we thought, where's a place where we can play together? And we quickly realized that we can't do it in a way that the organization is responsible for everything. We will be a lot more powerful when we empower others to build that type of diverse and vibrant place. So the jar was really born out of this idea to test a convening model whereby participants are invited to invite people who they would normally experience culture with, sort of their speed dials, and also invite people who they wouldn't normally experience culture with. And in that way, they're sort of starting to practice ways of coexisting more actively rather than the passive ways by which we live, right? Cities can be super diverse, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have diverse networks of friends and family. So the jar is sort of starting to break that and invite people in.
Well, I appreciate that because it is important that we all learn to lean into our discomfort, as I often say. I think that it is seldom the case that we have opportunities in community for deep listening and for this kind of connection that while initiated through these structured, organized means can ultimately lead to organic and loving flow of friendship and deep understanding. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the convener model and give us examples of what kinds of conveners you are most excited about? And
Sure.
also, as part of that, consider what we who live elsewhere might take to adapt for our own environments.
Yeah. So the convener model really is about actively inviting people to think of people who they would like to get to know better and the people who they normally experience culture with. So at the JAR, we don't have any single tickets. So for our in-person events, we have only these groups of tickets. So we invite you, so Maya, you might be a convener and you would be asked to bring a +1, whether that's a partner or whether a close friend, and then 2 people who you would normally experience culture with, so that'd be whoever you might spend your Saturday night with, and then 2 people who you might not normally experience culture with, 2 people who may not look like you, love like you, pray like you, be of the same age, whatever that might be for you. And then you go to the JAR. And there's sort of 3 things that we learned from this convener model that I'd love to share, which is, one is that it creates a room where there's no usuals or unusuals, right? There are certain rooms that we know, like when we go to this sort of classic spaces like symphonies, you kind of know who the usuals are. At the JAR, a younger Latino might be somebody's complete usual, and they might be somebody's complete unusual. So it sort of throws, it juxtaposes the idea of who's in power in the room. The second is no one's alone, right? A lot of the times we walk into spaces where they might say they're about building community, but they're not quite sure how to facilitate that. And in this way, the conveners, everybody's tied to 5 other people. And you know that everyone else is tied to 5 other people. So there's sort of an intentionality of community building. And the third part, which is something that I've been hearing since I was in college, which is that younger people are not interested in the cultural landscape, and the people of color are not interested in the cultural landscape. And we sort of said, that's not true. We're simply producing culture in a way that's not interesting or inviting to these groups. And at the JAR, we found this model to be very, very popular with younger people and Irish American white mailman and his wife. And this is somebody who's been delivering her mail for 20 something years, but they've never broken bread together, right? Society dictates for us who we pray with, who we experience culture with, who we love often. And this is a way to sort of circumvent that. So it's been fun to see conveners like that. Another one which was really fun. There was a younger Latino guy. He was a convener, and he brought his husband, and he sort of thought, who are 2 people I normally experience culture with, 2 other young gay men of color. And I thought, who do I not normally experience culture with? And he said, my mother-in-law. So he invited his mother-in-law and an older colleague. And the 6 of them sat around a table for the first time. And I think that's the thing, right? What you said, which is there's not many places that invite us for public reflection, both self-reflection, but also public reflection, a deep listening. And the model really invites that. And I think for those who don't live in Boston, the JAR for us, we're sort of what we call the JAR 1.0 at the moment. Which is Boston is a lighthouse. And we really hope that a 2.0 version is one that Boston is inspiring other communities to do the same. And we can start looking at how-to models for other cities. There was actually a community center in London which reached out to us, which is at the heart of a neighborhood that there are sort of working class white English, there's sub-Saharan African immigrants, there is a growing Muslim population from Pakistan, and they're sort of yuppies. And the community center is serving all four of them, but never at the same time. Each one of them has events in the venue, but they never come together. And they were looking at using the JAR model, the convener model, to break that apart a little bit.
I love the fact that once people participate in the JAR convening process, that it sounds like they begin to think about other spaces in their life where they can utilize these methods and try to generate similarly safe environments for surprising connection. So that's good because you have that ripple effect, presumably. Can you talk a bit more about what art plays, the role art plays in bringing people together in your estimation and in peace building and generating movements and justice? And, talk to me about what you think art can and does do in the JAR or, more broadly.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because before launching the JAR, I had over 300 coffee meetings over the course of 2 years. It's heavily caffeinated. And I was talking to a lot of people in the racial justice space and equity spaces and talking to them about how do you build community and how do you sort of approach your work. And a lot of the time they were saying, well, we gather people, we put them in a room and we talk about the problem. And I said, well, is that effective? And they said, well, actually, no. And I remember talking to a chief resilience officer at the city, and she said that by the end of events, it ended up being that they were more segregated in the room than when they started. And so I started thinking, well, no wonder you're asking people what's the thing that's different? What is the thing that's the problem? They will normally start splitting across differences and get tribal. And I think art allows us, one, to leave the intellectual headspace and more enter into a heart-centered space, an emotional space, and allows us to create a shared experience, something everybody can have an emotional response to. And I think that's the thing that art opens us up to. We can speak to our own personal experiences in a way that isn't led from here, but it's led from here. And when people talk from a heart-centered place, how can you disagree with them, right? Even when you might know there's political differences, there's ethnic differences, there's socioeconomic differences. Somebody's telling you about their personal experience, you're more likely to listen. And I think the arts can really lead in that sense. I think the other thing that's incredible about the arts that I've learned over the years is that, it's an imagined space in many times. And I think a lot of the time we're stuck in conflict in many regions. We're stuck in conflict because of a lack of imagination, right? And the lack of imagination leads us to separation. So I'm currently speaking to you from Tel Aviv in Israel, Palestine, and there's a lack of imagination on the ground. People can't imagine living together. They think that it will be easier and safer for them to live separately. And I think the arts can, in a way, be an inspiration to imagine a place where we actually are more joyful when we're together.
Yeah, agreed. I think that was very well stated. I know that when we look at photography and theater, dance, music, storytelling, creative writing at its best, that it offers us deep reflective opportunities, right? And we can testify and we can resist, but also we offer vision and inspiration for transformation, and it opens up space for divergent thinking, right? So I know that creativity is at the heart of peace. The peace must be creative, right? Because it seeks something that often isn't there, right? Because it's working with the raw material of conflict. And so I appreciate that. What John Paul Lederach calls the moral imagination is ignited. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask, how do you think we can nurture post-traumatic growth? I think about Palestine, and I think about, with a lot of these conflicts that have multi-generational impacts, as surely involving a lot of trauma. So how do we help people to emerge from trauma to a place of growth and possibility and healing?
It's a heavy and big question.
I know, and
I often think of this place, and I call it Trauma Land. I think this land I'm currently residing on is Trauma Land because the Palestinians who are here have been traumatized, and the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis that are here, have been traumatized. Right? We've been living in exile for 2,000 years, and I think just recognizing both of those truths is something that so many avoid. And that's so incredibly difficult. Just the notion, right, that for some 1948 was independence and for others it was a great day of destruction. Just the ability to carry two narratives is really difficult. I mean, I remember at a time when somebody would say they're coming to this land and they would say, I'm going to Palestine. My shoulders would tense up, right? Because I grew up with a certain notion that this place is called Israel. And I remember that a friend of mine said, well, why do you care what it's called for someone else? If for someone else that's Palestine, like, does that challenge what it means for you? Does that challenge what it is for you? Right? And when we think of renaming of neighborhoods, of streets, it's the ability to acknowledge two dualities. So I think that's like it's like the very basic step. And I think the other is, unfortunately, a lot of the times, especially in the American context, we think of very individual acts being helpful, right? I mean, we have a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is great because it invites individuals to become anti-racists. But I'm much more interested in the power of community and the power of how communities can overcome these systemic inequalities. And I think communities are responsible for healing trauma. It's not sort of it's not only person to person. And I think it's the act of gathering with one another and acknowledging each other's narratives and being able to say, I see you. And but it's much more than that. After that, it's changing a system. It's being willing to say, okay, I can see how this current system that I live in is actually benefiting me more than you. So I'm going to join you in building something new. And I think that's the part where there's the imagined space for what it is that we're building. And I think, trauma can go in many ways. In here, it's language-based, right? I mean, if we're going to have these conversations, they're expected to be had in Hebrew because Palestinians speak Hebrew and Jewish Israelis don't speak Arabic, the majority. And so what does that mean? That we're having a conversation about an imagined space in the language of the oppressor. So I think it's a lot of these questions around trauma uh, that have to be handled very delicately. I don't know that I certainly can't pretend to have the answer around it, but I think that something about experiencing each other's emotional life is a huge first step. And I always think of the JAR, when I think of the JAR movement building organizations that we partner with, say, well, what's the end goal? Are you going to bring us to, this and this? And I say, well, actually, it's from, if there's an A to Z, we really see ourselves in kind of the beginning. It's just getting you to the room and setting the right context by which you can share who your authentic self is, with all the trauma, with all the beauty, with all the joy, with all the pain. What happens afterwards? There's other organizations that may come through, but I think just the beginning, setting the context and reshaping the table so that people enter from the same door.
And walk in and out of each other's spaces comfortably, with fluidity and comfort and without fear. Yeah. And I think that what you say is true, that trauma has to be addressed by communities and community. It's not something that is a singular or individual process. There's only so far we can go because the traumas were created in concert with others, right? I mean, they were experienced often in collectives, but also we whether wittingly or unwittingly, we traumatize one another. And so the process of individual forgiveness or reconciliation, while it can perhaps ease some of the pain body, can bring down some of the anxiety. Ultimately, it can only take us so far. We have to think about the community body, right, in order to really heal. And I think about recent efforts at framing it in terms of embodied social justice, and which recognizes the somatic experience of trauma, hurt and harm, and the need for bodily healing, mental, social, and emotional, in the aggregate. So I'm grateful that JAR is part of that solution. I want to think about intergenerational duet, and you mentioned youth earlier and how we are not necessarily appealing to the kind of social processes that they find meaningful. We are not reaching out to them with images and language that connects, right? So if you would talk a little bit about how we do a better job, perhaps, of generating intergenerational duet, why that's important, perhaps?
Yeah, it's I come to it from a very, my own personal story is that I was always much more attracted to older people as a young person. I was always interested in their stories. I was always interested in what they had to say, and found myself in life from a younger age having a lot of older friends and younger friends, but more older, if I was honest. And I think there's something about the combination of the wisdom of the elders and the energy of the young, right? I mean, there's something very exciting about what's possible when you combine those together. And it's actually something that I find to be in the US, a much bigger problem, at least my experiences of having lived in Boston and also in New York, there's extreme segregation by age, right? You rarely see people in cross-generational groups. You rarely see spaces that are cross-generational, which is very different, I have to say, from the way I grew up in Israel and the way I experienced my community around me here. I just came from a dinner party and there were people all ages. There were young people, even though it was very late. There were children running around, and there were older people. And there's something so natural about that. It actually mimics what family life can be like. And I think in many ways, the systems that we have in place separate us. And I think if we can be more intentional about building spaces that are cross-generational. I mean, I know that for us, the JAR board, for example, right, the governing board of this organization, 50% of it is under the age of 45. And they were very intentional this year, as we're looking to add new board members. They said, we really want to add a board member who's under the age of 25, which we didn't have. They said, we want to have a student in the board, because if we're going to be in community building, we better have a student tell us what it is that we're missing. Like, what are we not thinking about? Let's hear their perspective. And the same thing, funnily enough, for us, one of our biggest challenges is actually recruiting older board members. So people over the age of 70. And the same thing, the board has been very intentional about finding those perspectives, because without those perspectives, we don't know how can we build a community without listening to that person's needs. So if you're 20, is there a certain accessibility need that is not being met? If you're 70, is there a certain accessibility need that is not being met? And it's literally, right, it's so simple. It's literally creating the seat at the table so that we know what is needed and also what is wanted. I think that was another thing when the JAR was started. Younger people were telling us we actually want the culture to come closer and closer to our homes. So we started programs that take place in people's homes, because a lot of community building, right, there's a sort of sense of, we expect the community to come to us. And here it's like, wait a minute, what about a movement that brings culture to the places where people live in a way that's fun for them to experience it with subject matters that relate to them? And we actually launched a brand new program line of salons in people's homes that responded to younger people's desire to build community in a much more intimate setting. And what we found with that is that people were exchanging phone numbers at a much higher rate. So we actually asked people, how many, have you exchanged phone numbers at this event? And more people are exchanging phone numbers. And that was something that we learned thanks to the fact that young people were telling us that that's something they lack in their life. They lack public space. They lack the fact that after university, they don't know how to ask somebody for their phone number. They don't know how to say, hey, do you want to have dinner? Because they've lost that certain space, because they'll just add them on Instagram. They'll follow their story, but they won't actually get to know the person. And that's something that actually is thankful for the wisdom of the old. The elders in the room at the JAR are much more comfortable saying to a younger person, hey, do you want to grab coffee? And then that tradition and that practice is learned by somebody younger. I mean, it may sound a little, ridiculous to say that, but it's a practice that we've forgotten, that my generation is forgetting. And it's something that we can certainly learn and be grounded in by older people.
Yeah, thank you. Having grown up in Indonesia and even here in Hawaii, I do see that there is a different way to be, where we can have multi-generational living, care, and exchanges of ideas, information, and wisdom. I was glad to see during the pandemic, in many spaces, young people helping, kupuna helping elders with utilizing digital tools, and the elders in turn, helping to nourish that sense of care where it was possible. Obviously there was also fracture during the pandemic, because people were concerned about the vulnerability of the elders, right? And there was a lack of personal peace, because people struggled to emerge from feelings of isolation and loneliness. And I wanted to ask you, like, how do you find personal peace in Tel Aviv or in your life in general? What are some tools and strategies that enable you to deepen your equanimity?
I'll make the Jewish joke of I'll rest and I'll be peaceful when I'm dead. But, I think for me, I've been practicing yoga since I was 16, a specific form of yoga, Iyengar. And I'm very glad for that. I'm very glad for those practices every week. And I think the other thing is, for me at least, the water, the Mediterranean Sea. I once a day, no matter what time of day, if I haven't gotten there yet, I'll go walk by the water and just listen to the waves. And there's something very calming about the fact that they keep waving, no matter what crazy things we humans are doing. Those waves keep coming at us, and I find that very, very peaceful. And I think also time with friends and time in community I find extremely peaceful. I actually said this to my local coffee shop barista, and I said, you really are a huge part of why I want to live here, like why I want to spend time here. Because every time I walk into this coffee shop, you say my name and you know things about me. You've met my mother, I've met your mother. We sit together when she finishes a shift, we sit outside together on a bench. There's something very communal. And I think a lot of life, there's so much hustle in life of running around. And I've been so grateful to find like a little corner where it feels peaceful. There's a little corner that I go to every day to have my coffee. And I sit there and there's other people who I've met, and it's a real community. I mean, it's bizarre. It's just around a geographical location, but we all know each other's names. And often we treat each other for coffee. So somebody else pays each time. And there's just something very peaceful about that. And people are from very different professions and very different walks of life. And it's very inviting. I find it to be a real privilege to spend time with them, to be able to spend that kind of endless coffee time.
I'm a coffee drinker, so it resonates with me as well. But I really appreciate your highlighting the fact that sometimes it is taking advantage of the small, simple opportunities for connection, and community that, again, personal peace often is aided greatly by the simple acts of interpersonal recognition, someone knowing your name. And you think about how helpful that is, and what that should perhaps inspire in us is a recognition of our own power to help build peace in the lives of others through recognizing them, listening to them, holding a little bit of space for them, offering them something warm to drink, you know.
There's a
Hopefully.
beautiful quote. There's a beautiful quote, Maya, that someone said, I can't remember who said it. There's make your heart a home for someone to run to. And I think that's what just what you're saying. It's just,
Yeah,
be the person who opens the heart for someone.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to ensure that we have time for questions. So those of you who are in this room or who are watching on our live stream, please do note questions in the chat, and I will ask you one more question before getting to some of those. And my question is actually asking you to recall a particular time and perhaps share some stories. In May 2021, after the ceasefire of the war between Israel and Gaza, the civil war that broke out, you were asked to co-facilitate a weekend retreat for a group of 20 something Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian artists. And I know that some powerful stories came out of that. Would you share some of that experience with us?
Sure. First of all, it was an incredible honor to join this group of artists. It was a group of artists that over the course of a year were convening every month for a full weekend together in a place called Neve Shalom, which is a sort of intentional village of peace of Palestinians and Jews. And it was actually supposed to happen, the convening supposed to happen during the war. Of course, it was postponed. And shortly after, we gathered, and I sort of led the group in a seminar that I've been doing for a few years called Finding Home, which is talking about a moment in which you struggled to find home, or a moment in which you really felt at home. And it was so incredibly moving to hear people speak after what everyone went through, to speak about their struggle. There was someone who was a second generation Holocaust survivor talking about the struggle to really feel of here, even though all she was told all her life was that this is hers. She said, culturally, I really feel like I don't fit. She came from a German Jewish family, and she said, I really don't feel like this is mine. And, very powerful stories from Palestinian artists. One who was at Al-Aqsa when the police raided it and was shot. And when she shared that was why we all realized why she was with crutches at the retreat. And everybody ended up writing a letter to their future, we called it sort of either future children or collective future children of this land, about a moment in which they felt at home. And they had to write it they were asked to write it in their native tongue. And that became very interesting, right? Half the room wrote in Hebrew and half the room wrote in Arabic. And I asked everybody, and then we switched the letters and everybody was given a letter. And then there was a realization, like it clicked for the Jewish members in the group suddenly, that they were the only ones who couldn't read everyone's letters. The Palestinians in the room could read Hebrew, they could read Arabic. And the Jews sort of were like, oh, it was so simple. But it took the act of somebody writing about something so personal like home, and they really want to know, like, what is it that you wrote about? Shit, I don't speak your language. And then what we did was I actually asked everybody to read them out loud And half the room didn't understand half the time. And it was sort of a, you know, a moment for them. One, I think for many Jewish Israelis, they hear Arabic and they freak out, right? It's just sort of a, oop, this is a language that feels unsafe to me. And the more and more they're experiencing their friends and people they love speak it and talk about a subject like home and realize that it's the sound of home for someone, it sort of makes it actually more of a peaceful language for them. And the second is the realization of how can we coexist here if we don't speak each other's language? And it ended up being an 8-hour-long workshop where everyone talked about, nobody read their own letters. People read other people's letters, and they had to talk about what they identified within it. And it brought people to tears because they heard their story being read to by someone else, and it wasn't signed. And there was something about that acknowledgement, like my story really matters, especially at a tense moment like this. And at the end of the evening, it was 10:30 when we finished, and everybody started drinking arak, which is our local anise, and smoking cigarettes, and we put on music, and everybody started dancing, and there was sort of a release. And it wasn't like, oh, it's all better now. I mean, we all knew where we were headed back to. But there was a sense of, I can create something with these people. Before, I wasn't sure. Like, I wasn't sure either. But after this, you sort of felt, okay, there's 19 other people who I can count on, who I can call, who can call me, and who we can start modeling this with one another. And it's not easy. There's certainly a lot of steps forward beyond the intention, but just the beginning of that imagined space, right, at a time when it's unimaginable being together, was very, very, very moving.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like I was there almost in your telling. I certainly wish that I could be in the presence of that energy. I think about language as a carrier of culture, of heart, of connection. How here in Hawaii, a lot of folks nearly lost Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language in their communities. But there has been a beautiful revival and resurgence, and how that has meant so much for the communities here, both for those who are Kanaka, who are Hawaiian, and for those who are afforded an opportunity to listen and to learn, and there's a sort of recognition and an understanding that comes from absorbing those rhythms, that cadence, also what is at the heart of that, the feeling, the hurt, the strength, the celebration. There's a lot in language. I wonder, well, I want to get to other people's questions, so let me be still for a moment.
We're finding inner peace even in our caffeinated hours.
One question is, do you plan to replicate the jar in Israel or in other places around the world? This process, are there places that you think could really benefit from your convening process, and where you plan to go?
I can't imagine a place that wouldn't benefit from this convening process, right? Because it's the intention of building community, and what could be better than that? What could be better than building community and starting to get to know the neighbors who you wouldn't normally get to know? One of the things I've often thought about, what would it look like here? And the language thing kind of stops me every single time, because the art, what language would the art be in? And what language would the discussion be in? And in many ways, for practical reasons, they have to be in Hebrew. And that already starts us on an unequal footing. So I don't know yet, but I'm excited by the fact that there are people who are looking at this model and starting to practice it outside of the jar. Whether it's people who are at, jar community members who start hosting dinner parties like this on their own, outside of the jar's facilitation. And I think that's I'm very interested in the scaling of this. How can we as an organization, we're not there yet at all, we're very small at the moment, but as we grow, really grow to be a resource for other communities to do this process. I mean, I was just thinking I just came from, a dinner party at my neighbor's, who I met at my local coffee shop. And he hosted a dinner party for incoming Russian refugees, folks who were fleeing Moscow because they were fearing of being jailed, artists and journalists. And I ended up inviting a Russian woman who I met, very recently, who came here. And I said to the host, hey, is it okay if I bring this woman with me? And he said, of course, like, this is what it's for. And there was a moment when I saw her finding community among her own people here in a displaced life. And then it wasn't the host who spoke. It was one of the guests. And one of the guests who actually helped everyone, we all made varenikas together. It's sort of these Russian dumplings. And everybody was around a table making this food together, right? So there's the sensory of it, there's the smell of it. And after eating, after everybody got their bowl, she just said that this is an awful time. I have no idea when I'll be able to see my friends again. I have no idea when I'll be able to go back to my theater and to my language. But isn't this kind of crazy that you can create community so instantaneously? And, everybody teared up. And she asked her daughter to bring out her guitar, and they started playing, and they sang Russian folk songs. And these, the locals in the room were invited to experience these people's homes at their home, right, on their homeland. And there was something so powerful about that, because it was making, as we said before, right, making the space for somebody to really feel and be at home. And so the convening model, right, the +2+2, that's sort of, it provides a framework to allow people to bring a little bit of their home.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit about home and how you define home? Because this notion of finding home. I mean, the word home has come up for some time, and because you are working in places where that notion of home is a perpetually contested notion. I'm curious about how you define home for yourself.
It really is changing, and it has changed a lot since COVID. I spent most of my life in the United States, and during COVID, in certain circumstances, I ended up getting on a plane and coming here to be with my family. And my sister ended up moving back here after living in the Philippines, and my nephews were here, and for the first time we were all around the same table. And my sister also ended up moving to live in my great-grandfather's house, in the very same house that he built. And I never thought before of home being a physical place. So I have a sense also of that. For the very first time, sort of being there, especially in springtime, which was just a little bit ago, there was the smell of oranges. And when you walk, when you get to that piece of land, the smell of oranges just hits you immediately. And the smell is like, that smells like home. And so I just a few days ago, ended up buying a little citrus tree for my balcony, because that smell for me is so important for home. And then there was another thing of a sense of home that became clear, which is the theater and creative people. And just feeling at home, no matter where they're from. When I am around other people who are in the theater, I feel at home, because it's my place of worship. When I walk into a theater, it could be in Bulgaria, it could be in Havana, and I just feel immediately at home, because I know the traditions of the place. I know what we do in this space. I know what this space was created for. And so there's a real sense of, okay, this is a place where people like me do this thing that I love to do. So it's both, but it's ever evolving.
No, thank you. I think about all of the movement and migration and displacement and, refugees, and, our world is shifting, and sometimes it is a sense of curiosity that prompts that movement, and sometimes it is tragedy and disaster, right? And but we all need to, I think, find peace, and part of that is discovering, sometimes redefining a home in surprising ways. Well, thank you. I have one more question here that someone has sent me, which is, what is, well, basically, have you, just trying to consolidate a couple of questions, have you ever encountered a time when civil conversation was impossible or felt impossible in one of your convening, where it was really difficult or challenging, and where you worried that whether it was a jar convening, or salon, whether you worried that there was an unbridgeable gap?
Yeah. It wasn't at the jar, it was at in my previous role at Israeli Stage. We had a play called The Last Act that we staged, sort of a political thriller, and a play which was so politically potent it couldn't be produced in Israel. There was censorship. And we had dialogues following every single show. We had six or seven shows a week, and every single show had dialogues with the audience where they talked to one another. And I remember one night where a younger Latinx woman who was in the audience shared her experience of the play and of the space. And an older Jewish man in the audience just said, who are you to even say anything about this place? Have you even been there? Do you know anything about it? And sort of going at it. And, you know, the facilitator sort of said, hey, you know, we have to, why are you coming at this woman? You don't know who she is, and she has a right to share her words. But the room froze. And there was a real sense of who feels at home in this space. Because of the name of the company, because of the majority in the room. There was a usuals, right? There were the usuals and unusuals. The usuals in the room were Jewish Americans, and the unusuals were the non-Jewish Americans. And I think because of, you know, because of trauma, right? This older man shutting this woman down completely inappropriately and out of place was doing so because of trauma, right? He felt that his homeland was being questioned and that his trauma was being completely ignored. Whether that's valid or not, I think is for another point. But that was a time I really remembered, and I thought, I don't think this space could continue. And I remembered a story that I was told by a community organizer friend of mine, Malia Lazu, in Boston, who said, it's actually a Ghanaian folktale where it's a story of a giraffe and an elephant. And the giraffe and elephants have been friends for years, and they've been meeting by the lake. And one time the giraffe said, well, why don't you come over to my house? And the giraffe prepared some peanuts in a bowl and, you know, was preparing for his elephant friend to come. And when the elephant knocked on the door and tried walking through the door, he couldn't fit. It wasn't the right door. And the elephant started pushing through, and the giraffe said, stop, you're breaking my house. And I think that moment in the audience, with the audience, I realized that I was a part of building and founding something that was a house for giraffes, but not for elephants. And I thought we have to shut this down, and it'll be very painful, but we have to reinvent it and evolve it into a house that can fit giraffes, elephants, zebras, and all their friends through the door. We often don't even recognize that people can't enter.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this robust conversation. And I think someone in our chat said, wow, such a beautiful discussion. Have to put my child to bed in London, but we'll have much to think about, like intentional communities, building communities with intention and themes that are relevant to the work I'm doing in games and gaming. So I think that you know, the application of these ideas in a number of different spaces is exciting and filled with innumerable possibilities, and that people will try to generate this kind of fructifying, productive, meaningful, heart-centered, sustained dialogue and connection. So thank you for this time. I would like to thank Jose Barzola, as always, in the Matsunaga Institute for organizing these conversations, as well as Zephanie, who does so much to assist in thoughtful ways. In order to learn more about the Matsunaga Institute, please do visit peaceinstitute.manoa.hawaii.edu. This conversation will live on through social media, but will also be published in long form via the Matsunaga Institute's YouTube page. Please do share the link with others and go out and create conversations around what you learned and heard today, and follow the Matsunaga Institute on Eventbrite to register for future events. Thank you all so much for your time, your energy, and your community building. Aloha. And shalom. And shukran.